every Thursday at noon, discussing various dimensions of the arts-science marriage. My task today, of course, it is a very easy task because it is to introduce someone who really needs no introduction to an audience such as this. Dr. Suzuki, probably the most widely known scientist in Canada, and who is presently teaching at the University of British Columbia, has brought the university into the homes of millions of Canadians throughout Canada. He started in 1970 with his CBC TV Vancouver series, Suzuki and Science, and the successor to that series was Science Magazine. And I'm happy to, again, remind you that this series will once again appear on television beginning Sunday, February the 1st at 5 p.m. But it is very easy, again, to present him to an audience such as this because many of you will remember that he came to Loyola in March 1975 as Loyola's special lecturer during Founders Week. At that time, he spoke on genetics and the destiny of man. And I can assure you that he captivated his audience at Loyola last year, the same as he captivates his audience every time he appears on television. Today, Dr. Suzuki will speak on arts and science, a topic that is very close to the students and faculty members in the Loyola Faculty of Arts and Science, particularly at this time. Dr. Suzuki.
Well, the title of my talk is a bit of a misnomer because I'm really going to talk about genetics and society. I was rather surprised and flattered to have been invited back to Concordia after having been here last year. And I want to say how delighted I am that the university here is attempting to perpetuate a Faculty of Science and Arts, because I think that one of the great tragedies of modern academia has been the schism between the arts and faculty areas and the institutionalization of the schism through faculties of science and bachelors of science degrees. I personally am a graduate of a liberal arts education, so I have my prejudices that way. And I'd like to say simply that any person who is educated, I think, would have to admit that the most potent force that shapes society today is science and its application through technology. To deny that is to deny the reality of the incredible changes that have taken place in the last 20 years. And yet, at my university, it's possible to get a Bachelor of Science degree having taken one course in the arts, generally freshman English, which usually is concerned with redressing the lousy education they've had in high school in writing and reading. It's possible for art students to get a Bachelor of Arts having taken one half-year course without a laboratory in science. And I say those two groups are graduating with degrees, but they are ignorant of large, important segments of their culture and their society. And I think it's a tragedy that these people can be given a degree and call themselves university graduates. Human consciousness, self-awareness, released human beings from the constraints of pure instinct and the present moment. It's been both the curse and the greatness of human existence, that human consciousness. Our brains allowed us to create an entirely new universe of thought, of dreams, of imagination, and love. And a fantastic concept was invented by that consciousness, time. We created a past and a future. It never existed, neither existed, before the dawn of human consciousness. And with that consciousness, humans wondered what the stars are, why they move across the sky. They wondered why they were here, how they got here, and who they are. And out of these questions, this uniquely human quality of curiosity, came many of our finest forms of art: poetry, music, painting, religion, and science. The world to primitive humans must have been terrifyingly chaotic because of its unpredictability. The environment was hostile and terrifying. Of course, they did recognize, early humans, that there were predictable events. Animal and plant behavior allowed humans to depend on that and to get their food. Cycles of day and night, seasons, and the rise and fall of tides were things that primitive people recognized. But storms, earthquakes, eclipses, drought, and predatory creatures were not nearly so predictable. Out of this terrifying chaos, the human mind constructed order, a mythology of gods and goddesses on whom one could ascribe our existence and the vagaries of nature. These myths allowed primitive people to accept life. When the earth shakes, a god is turning over in bed. And for tens of thousands of years, pockets of human beings struggled to survive with only one evolutionary advantage over all other creatures: a gigantic and complex brain. Stone weapons and that brain more than made up for a lack of claws, fangs, armor plates, and great muscles. Indeed, when Paleolithic people squirted into North America from Asia, they swept south and wiped out all of the large animals, mammoths, tigers, sloths, camels, in their advancing front all the way to the tip of South America. Still, life was tough, and thousands of nomadic tribes, wandering here and there in search of edible plants and game, were wiped out by pestilence, starvation, or fighting. Only 10,000 years ago, some Neolithic genius, no doubt fed up with all of the constant hiking and camping around in different places, realized that a seed, if put into the ground, would sprout into a plant. This fantastic intellectual breakthrough revolutionized human evolution and heralded the beginning of civilization. For now, if seeds were planted near a spring, as the records near Mount Carmel in Israel show, people were freed from constantly having to move, gather, and hunt. In such a settlement, unconscious selection occurred. People gathered gourds and fruits and ate them near their settlement and threw the seeds about, and those seeds sprouted up as plants that could be used for further eating. Wild animals such as cattle, sheep, goats, and dogs were attracted to the domesticated plants, began to hang around the fields, and eventually were captured and kept in fences to provide those humans with power, food, and clothing. Homo sapiens had become a farmer. As the land was cleared to plant more crops, fruit and nut trees were left standing. Everything else was wiped down, and soon they became the orchards. Within a few hundred years, farms flourished. Labor had to become diversified. Carpenters had to build fences and shelters, warriors to fight off marauding nomads, farmers to till the fields, and shepherds to look after the animals. And no doubt several people tried to justify their existence by calling themselves politicians or teachers. In less than 200 years, the farmers in Israel had a population explosion. 1,000 people living on 20 acres of cultivated land. And during this time, another fantastic insight was made. Like begets like. This foundation of modern genetics can be found over and over, repeated in the mythology of ancient cultures as a profound fact of life. When the Bible was written in Genesis, you'll find repeated reference to God's creations, reproducing each according to its kind. Using that principle, farmers were able to breed fine grains, sheep with fleece, and tame cattle and horses. Within 2,000 years, most of the domestic animals and plants we use today had already come under cultivation. In Genesis, two important injunctions were prescribed. Go forth and multiply and fill the earth, clearly a dictum leading inevitably to a Malthusian population explosion. And the second one was have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the fowl of the air and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. That biblical injunction clearly saw the role of humans as the master over nature. But recognizing the power of animal and plant breeding, it was inevitable that scholars would begin to ask whether humans were subject to the same principles. Those incredible people, the ancient Greeks, toyed with the idea of directing human evolution. And Plutarch records the life of Lycurgus, who was the founder of Sparta of the times, who set out a program of state-run genetics councils which would determine those couples to be allowed to have children, and once the children were born, within a month they had to be brought before the council by the father, and the council then, or committee, determined whether that child should be allowed to live. And as you all know, if it wasn't fit to be a Spartan, it was left to die at the foot of Mount Taygetus. If it was considered Spartan material, it was put in the hands of other people who would raise it. The ancient forerunner of daycare centers, I suppose. Now, you might think, well, that occurred in Sparta because those guys were a bunch of jocks. They were running around. They weren't too bright. And really, if they had been a little more intellectual, they never would have tried to carry out such a program. But even in intellectual, aesthetic Athens, Plato has Socrates suggesting that since it's so important to breed hunting dogs and birds carefully, and surely the state should take a hand in controlling human breeding as well. Those ideas never took hold, although they were debated throughout the millennia. In the 16th and 17th century, Francis Bacon recognized the potential power of using science to aid human progress. He said, knowledge is power. Progress he defined as dominating nature, as it's stated in Genesis. We all accept, I think, Bacon as the father of modern science, and he set in motion science and technology to recognize the biblical statement of having dominion over every living thing. By the early 19th century, Mary Shelley published her classic work, Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus, in which it was clear how far society had come along in realizing Bacon's dream of dominion over nature. Because now the unpredictable acts of gods were gone, Dr. Frankenstein, brilliant scientist, set out to solve the secret of life and death, and in so doing, replace the gods with science. By the late 19th century, Friedrich Nietzsche in Germany called for a new morality in the creation of a Superman. Creative thirst, an arrow of desire for the Superman. Say, my brother, is this thy will to marriage? Wholly call I such a will and such a marriage. Thus spake Zarathustra. I needn't belabor the popularity of racist ideas in Germany. The publication of Darwin's book on the origin of species showed how organisms could evolve by natural selection. Survival of the fittest became the rallying cry for social Darwinism, an ideology that justified the ruling powers by the law of the jungle. Many biologists formed a new discipline called eugenics, or true genetics, and its aim was to improve humans by selective breeding. Positive eugenics meant the improvement through encouraging those types considered to be the most desirable to reproduce more than the average reproductivity of the rest of the population. Negative eugenics was improvement through discouragement or prevention of those types considered bad from contributing to the next generation. Now, I should point out that most of the great biologists of the day, at the turn of the century, were ardent champions of eugenics, loudly proclaiming the degeneration of human populations. Eugenics flourished in Germany, England, and the United States, heavily funded by the Krupps in Germany and the Rockefellers and Harrimans in the United States. I think it's very interesting that these supporting families realized or recognized that they were the types that were the most desirable. What were considered some of the good types to be fostered by positive eugenics? Ernst Haeckel, one of the great German biologists in the 19th century, argued that Jesus Christ was an ideal type. But he was ideal because Mary had in fact been seduced by Joseph Pandera, a Roman soldier, so that Roman genes contributed to Jesus' good qualities, not the Jewish genes. Of course, the tall, blonde Aryan was a generally accepted ideal type. What were some of the bad qualities? Everyone agreed at that time that Negroes were inferior, almost subhuman. And I think it would it would be a very interesting exercise for each of you to read Gobineau's racial stereotypes of blacks and Asians to understand the kind of thinking that anthropologists were in at that time. Haeckel wanted to eliminate people with hereditary characteristics such as tuberculosis, syphilis, and mental disease. Karl Pearson in England, who was a eugenicist at Oxford, wanted to remove criminals, neurotics, and tuberculosis. Charles Davenport, a geneticist in the United States, welcomed immigrants from Germany, Poland, and Scandinavia. He had very mixed feelings about Italians and Irish, and he deplored the influx of what he called the Hebrews. He warned, and I quote, "The population of the United States will, on account of the great influx of blood from southeastern Europe, rapidly become darker in pigmentation, smaller in stature, more mercurial, more attached to music and art, more given to crimes of larceny, kidnapping, assault, murder, rape, and sex immorality, and less given to burglary, drunkenness, and vagrancy than were the original English settlers." End of quote. With the discovery of genetic principles in 1900, the eugenics movement got off the ground, and by 1910, most geneticists believed that human behavior and intelligence followed the same simple laws as flower color in peas or feather pattern in chickens. 1911, Davenport, who I just read a passage from, published a book indicating that human traits such as nomadism or criminality were simple Mendelian units. In 1917, he published a paper entitled "The Effects of Race Intermingling," in which he stated that since races had evolved over long periods of time in isolation, mixing of different races would produce what he called disharmonious combinations. He used as evidence studies on egg-laying in chickens. He wrote, and I quote, "A hybridized people are a badly put-together people and a dissatisfied, restless, ineffective people." In 1918, the most widely read text on eugenics was published by Popenoe and Johnson. They argued that Negroes were inferior to whites because blacks had made no significant contributions to what they considered civilization. Blacks were barbaric in Africa. They had not done well when transplanted to Haiti, and they had failed to reach white standards in the United States. They concluded, I quote, "In general, the white race loses and the Negro gains from miscegenation." End of quote. Edward East, Harvard professor, outstanding geneticist who became president of the American Genetics Society, wrote in 1919, and I quote, "In reality, the Negro is inferior to the white. This is not hypothesis or supposition. It is a crude statement of actual fact." End of quote. Geneticists reacted favorably to his work, and no one spoke out against it. And it was only by the 1930s that geneticists began to realize that human heredity and behavior was much more complex than they had thought. And so their sentiment shifted to a more neutral position of, well, we really can't say for sure. And it was only the onset of Nazi race doctrines during World War II that the attitudes of geneticists really changed. And it was revulsion against the application of these racist doctrines in Germany that really caused the change. By the end of the war, although no great breakthroughs or new insights into human genetics had been made, geneticists now claimed as their orthodoxy, race crossing would sometimes be beneficial, but never detrimental. Now, I've spent some time outlining the attitudes of the scientific community to try to drive home to you the fact that scientists should not be expected to exhibit any special insight or wisdom because of their expertise. Indeed, the applications of fashionable ideas in science are often jumped on by scientists without the kind of critical scrutiny they subject scientific research to. There is no such thing as an absolute truth in science. Today's truth can be tomorrow's superstition. For example, we think today, with all of our fancy science, that it's amazing that some primitive people don't realize that conception results from a single act of intercourse. Yet Charles Darwin, one of the greats in biology, found it inconceivable that a single sperm fertilizes an egg, and that's what develops into a complete human being. Now, this brief, very personal interpretation of history brings us to 1976, a time that surely approaches the realization of human dominion over the earth. Gone are the gods on whom we can blame the vagaries and mystery of nature. For now, scientists promise us that they will provide all of the answers. No longer do we accept natural calamities as the will of gods. We're trying to conquer them. Gone is pestilence. Weather is not only predictable, but modifiable. The same holds with earthquakes and floods. We will create fusion reactions of the sun in laboratories on Earth. Our artifacts probe through the solar system, and our telescopes peer to the very edge of the universe. The rate of change is so rapid that we now accept change as the one part of our everyday life that we can rely on. Far more important, yet less obvious, is the long-term impact of all of these innovations that are happening on the very fabric of human society and on our image of ourselves. The real crisis in modern society is that we no longer have the time for reflection, nor the broad knowledge and information to assess the consequences of new discoveries, or the machinery to take action for the protection of individual rights. And that's why I feel justified in repeating the lecture I gave here at Concordia last year, because I'm trying to point out, with the specific discussion about genetics and human society, why we need the cross-fertilization of arts and science. Now, you only have to compare the mores of 1976 with the 40s, when many of us grew up before the birth control pill. And when you try to remember our attitudes then towards pocketbooks, pornographic magazines, sex movies, premarital sex, or abortions, you realize what a tremendous way we have come. Now, it may be naive for me to blame all of these changes, or not blame, but to lay all of these changes on the pill. But I think there is no question that the pill's impact has been phenomenal. We haven't even begun to assess the long-term societal ramifications of that one simple discovery in terms of divorce, family, and so on. Aldous Huxley wrote shortly after the explosion of the first atomic bomb, and I quote, "The release of atomic energy marks a great revolution in human history, but not the final and most searching revolution. The really revolutionary revolution lies not in the external world, but in the souls and flesh of human beings." End of quote. Now, those were very prophetic words, because in my view, the 1970s marked the time where our understanding of basic molecular mechanisms of human biology have brought with it fantastic powers of control and manipulation that were undreamed of 30 years ago. Yet I can't help feeling that in terms of our ability to handle this new knowledge and technology, we are like Neanderthal men given computers, bombs, and rockets all at once. The genetic wizardry, now possible in test tubes and with microorganisms, is truly fantastic. The genetic code has been completely deciphered. A handful of small genes has been synthesized in test tubes. Specific genes have been isolated and purified. Chromosomes of viruses have been reproduced in test tubes. And a whole new technology makes it possible to insert gene segments into bacteria and viruses almost at will. Indeed, the entire sequence of genes from the fruit fly Drosophila has been cut into small pieces and inserted individually into bacteria. The technology of gene manipulation has progressed so far and so rapidly that over the past 2 years, I'm sure most of you have seen that scientists have been trying to impose, for the first time in the history of science, guidelines within which research should be done and beyond which research should not be done. Now, that is an incredible step. I should point out, though, that two of the major utilizers of science are the military and industry. And those two groups are not noted for their concern about the interests of the general public, and yet they have been notably absent in the discussions about guidelines for molecular surgery. And yet, all of the information allowing the manipulation of genes and viruses in test tubes is out in the open literature and available to military and industry. So I question the usefulness of guidelines set without the inclusion of those two major groups. It's my belief, though, that in the long run, dangers from genetics lie not with the genetic manipulation in test tubes, but in the misguided application of the simple laws of inheritance that have been known since the early 1900s and have been practiced actually since Neolithic times. I would submit that in the next decade, a new slogan will become highly accepted among the population. All people have the right to give birth to a healthy, normal child. Science and medicine hold the prospect of great success at realizing this wish. Indeed, Cecil Jacobson, a geneticist in Washington, D.C., has said, and I quote, "I'm certain in the near future everybody's wish is going to be, I wish my child to be able to someday give birth to a totally normal child. I want to bring that wish to fulfillment." End of quote. But I submit that from that sentiment, every person has the right to give birth to a healthy, normal child. From that sentiment comes the converse statement, all unhealthy, abnormal children have no right to survive. Of course, it won't be as crudely stated as that. There will be all kinds of philosophical rationalization about happiness and worth and cost-benefit analyses, but it all comes down to that. Do you think we should fear that? Is that really the far-out rantings of a paranoid scientist? I think it's important that you remember that in this country, the infamous use of the War Measures Act, as well as Oriental exclusion laws, assumed the hereditary basis of racial characteristics such as treachery, deceit, and loyalty to land of origin, and contravened all rights supposedly guaranteed by the law. But now I see a new wave of eugenics thinking couched in non-obvious racist language in the jargon of modern science. Pop books like Territorial Imperative, On Aggression, Naked Ape, and African Genesis all suggest that much of human behavior is instinctive, innate, genetic, and hence, by implication, unavoidable. It is in this kind of latent racist societal context that I see the greatest danger of the new biology. Psychologists tell us that one of the most significant contributions made to society by psychology is the IQ test. Begun originally as a predictive device, it has become fixed in the popular mind as some kind of index of intelligence, even though I have found no universally accepted definition of what intelligence is. And now the Jensens and the Shockleys purport to have proved that the average IQ difference between blacks and whites is genetically determined, even though no reputable geneticist, and neither Shockley nor Jensen nor Eysenck are geneticists, even though no reputable geneticist has accepted the validity of their so-called evidence. And since this is such a vital issue, I'd like to indicate why their conclusions and their research is totally unacceptable. I'll use an example that was related to me by Walter Bodmer, who's a professor of genetics at Oxford. Let us take as an analogy with intelligence, assuming assuming there is a genetic basis for IQ. I'll make an analogy with the IQ thing with the height of plants. Now that's a much simpler genetic situation. The brain, of course, is a much more complex thing. If we take a bag of bean seeds, we take a handful of bean seeds and throw it on the ground, cultivate it, water it, and let them grow up, we will find a normal bell-shaped curve for the distribution of plant height in that population. And if we take the plants at the tall end and compare them genetically with the plants at the low end, we'll find they're genetically different. The ones at the low end will give rise to progeny which are taller, the ones at the high end. The ones at the low end will give rise to progeny that are shorter. and the ones in the middle will be genetically different from either end. So we say height of plants has a genetic component. Now we take from that same bag of beans 2 handfuls of seeds. One we plant on fertile ground, the other we plant on sandy, rotten soil. We let them grow up. At the end of that time, we measure the height of the plants in the 2 populations. We again get normal bell-shaped curves, but the average height in the 2 populations will be different. Now, if we look at the ones grown on fertile soil, we'll find that the tall ones are genetically different from the short ones, which are different from the middle ones. Height in that population is genetically determined. If we look at the height distribution in the lousy soil, the tall ones are genetically different from the short ones, which are different from the middle. So again, height is genetically determined. But now if we look at the means of the 2 populations, there is no way that you can say that the difference in the means is a reflection of their genetic composition because they come from the same genetic population. Here, clearly, the difference is environmentally determined. And there is no way that Jensen or Shockley will ever be able to prove a genetic basis for IQ differences between blacks and whites until we have a society that does not see color, which is colorblind. And that is where a black will grow up under conditions that are exactly the same as whites. And that is not possible within the foreseeable future. And therefore, I can only conclude that either the Shockleys and the Jensens are very ignorant or they are highly mischievous. Now, even more frightening to me, more frightening than the Herrnsteins and Jensens, the Shockleys and Jensens, because they're easy to deal with, are people like Richard Herrnstein, who's a psychologist at Harvard University. Herrnstein has published a book called IQ and the Meritocracy, and his suggestion is that in a democratic society, the movement of people through the various class levels is determined by ability. That ability is genetically determined, and therefore social class in North America is genetically determined. In other words, someone who is in a high position, like the Rockefellers or the Harrimans, occupy that position because their genes indicate that they are of that genetic type. Those people who are in the low end of the social level are there because their genes determine that that's where they should be. And he claims that the more movement there is through the social strata, the greater the likelihood that we are going to have biological ghettos where class grouping is dictated by heredity. Now, if you think that's far out kind of thinking, in Canada, an anthropologist at the University of British Columbia has published a scientific paper based on FBI data in which he claims that blacks can be shown to have an innate tendency to kill. A geneticist at the University of Ottawa a few years ago suggested that we should give government bonuses to university graduates who marry and have children to encourage the reproduction of high intelligent types. And as you all know, the degree doesn't say anything about intelligence. I talked with that man yesterday when I was at the University of Ottawa, and he still holds to that position. A past president of the Canadian Medical Association a few years ago suggested that welfare recipients should be sterilized before they get their welfare checks to keep them from a disproportionate input into the population. Now, in addition to the race, social class, and IQ controversy, there's a new element introduced. A great deal of research money today is going into the study of ethnic disease. Study that shows that there are hereditary diseases found predominantly or exclusively in one racial or ethnic group. For example, Tay-Sachs disease appears to be almost exclusively found among Jews of an Ashkenazi background. Sickle cell anemia is found many, many times higher among blacks than among the white population. Cooley's anemia is found predominantly in southern Mediterranean types. Now consider that work alongside the suggestion of geneticist Carl Larsson from Sweden, published in a journal called Military Review in 1970, that weapons with tremendous ethnic specificity could be easily constructed. What he has shown is that there are a number of genetic characteristics that differ from one racial or ethnic group to another in resistance or sensitivity to a variety of drugs. If one were able to catalog a number of these differences, then weapons with extreme ethnic specificity should be readily and cheaply constructed. And that has, to me, phenomenal implications for the future of warfare. Out of that comes, of course, the question of the extent to which biological warfare will develop, because it's clear that new techniques of gene manipulation will allow the insertion of genes into bacteria and viruses almost at will. This brings with it the possibility, of course, of creating bacteria that produce insulin, bacteria that will make fertilizer from the air, but also indestructible and deadly microbial weapons, as well as microorganisms which would be able to induce hereditary defect as well as correct it. And I ask the question, are there any limits to the horrible imagination and inventiveness of the military scientists? And I'm convinced there ain't none. We've gone through a period of incredible prosperity and abundance since the Second World War. But now that we've found the perfect solution to using up our bumper crops of grains, namely funneling it through a cow, which takes 21 pounds of grain protein to make 1 pound of meat, aid programs are coming under increasing fire from politicians. Environmentalist Garrett Hardin has resurrected the concept of triage, which was used by the French in the First World War. And you'll all recall in the triage program, the wounded are divided into 3 classes. Those which, if given medical attention, will die anyway. They're hopeless. They're dead. There are those which, if you don't give them any medical aid, will get better on their own. And then there's a middle one where, if given some attention, people have a chance to survive. And the French solution was to concentrate all of the medical attention on the middle group, those which have a chance of surviving if they're given aid. Now, what Hardin suggests is that it's time to apply triage to much of the Third World in order to retain what he calls the American way of life. He says this even though we in the industrialized countries are often exploiting the very resources of the underdeveloped countries that keep them in that position, and when one of the major health problems in North America today comes from overeating. I bring this up because I feel the issue of triage is at the nub of many of our problems. What defines human beings to me as something very special and worthwhile is that we have this very strange quirk and quark of love, compassion, and charity. We'll struggle, love, and agonize over a crippled or mentally defective person. But if we can now talk of stopping aid to countries while surviving on our high-protein diets, while making synthetic food substitutes like saccharin, and feeding enough protein to pet animals to sustain the entire Third World, then I wonder what that says about us as people in a spiritual sense. And when our own resources really do run low, as they inevitably will we again draw the line against our own people, with the line being drawn to exclude the elderly, or the crippled, or the mentally defective, the troublemakers, the poor, or just the different? Now, I don't want to go on outlining some of the techniques that allow us to monitor fetuses inside a mother's body. There are all sorts of techniques available for determining the genetic constitution prenatally of a child. We can determine the sex very easily. This is being used to avoid diseases such as Duchenne's muscular dystrophy or hemophilia, which afflict only boys and are inherited from the mother. By determining that a child is going to be a boy, which has a 50% chance of inheriting such a defect, one can abort them and avoid the birth of a defective child. Amniocentesis, fetoscopy, ultrascan, these are all techniques that are now available for monitoring the fetus inside the mother's body. All of these techniques can be used and are being used to avoid the birth of a genetically defective child through abortion. The most obvious types of tests are, of course, the ones on Duchenne's and hemophilia, or on women over the age of 35 who have over 40 times the chance of having a Mongol child as a woman who is much younger. Many problems, it seems to me, arise from this kind of prenatal diagnosis. Where does one draw the line of acceptable or unacceptable defects? With Mongolism, albinism, hair lip, diabetes, short-sightedness? Or will we begin to worry with microscopes that we can now insert into a mother's womb about the size of our baby's nose, its sex, IQ, or eye color? Who makes the decision on whether or not to abort? And we still have to resolve the basic issue of abortion. I don't think that we've dealt with that on any kind of level that makes it reasonable, at least to me. If we begin to assess the birth of children solely on a cost-benefit analysis, and have no doubt hereditary defects are incredibly costly to society, what does that do to the essence of human dignity? Do we strive for perfection by eliminating the substandard or the too expensive? What is the standard of acceptability or rejection? And if a child is born with a hereditary defect that is normally aborted, will that child feel itself to be a second-class citizen? Leon Cass has said, in fact, and I quote, "A child with a genetic defect, born at a time when most of his potential fellow sufferers were destroyed prenatally, is liable to be looked upon by the community as one unfit to be alive, as a second-class or even lower type." Cass feels that this could lead to the idea that defectives should not be born. And this, in fact, is supported by statements attributed to Cecil Jacobson, who has performed over 700 amniocenteses. He says, and I quote, "I can't imagine any reasonably responsible person arguing against the abortion of Mongols," end of quote. And yet in my personal experience, I have met dozens of people who have argued against the abortion of Mongols, people who have themselves brothers, sisters, or children who are Mongols. And I would suggest that Jacobson's implication that those people are unreasonable or responsible are really suggestions that should be made towards Jacobson himself. Last fall, I was in California, and while I was there, I was astounded to read in the November 9th, 1975 issue of the San Francisco Sunday Examiner and Chronicle the following headline, and I quote, "United States screens children of the poor for deviance," end of quote. Now the report read as follows, and I'm going to quote extensively from it. 13 million children of the poor are the latest targets for federal government intervention in the lives of U.S. citizens. Some critics would call it spying. The Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, conducting the mission, is offering free medical tests for the children in all poverty families. The program, called Early and Periodic Screening, Diagnosis, and Treatment, EPSDT, aims to detect and prevent health problems among children who lack access to medical facilities. That sounds great. But even as doctors probe these children for physical defects and symptoms of disease, they also test for personality and psychological disorders to label potential problem children, the deviants, and criminals. Unknown to the mother, doctors will observe and grade the relationship between parent and child. The findings are then recorded in the child's federally computerized dossier. End of quote. I needn't reiterate the recent revelations about the CIA and FBI in the United States to emphasize the horrific possibilities even in a so-called democracy. Now, I don't have any answers as to what we should do. I personally will oppose any attempt to legislate required amniocentesis or large genetic screening programs in this country. I'm also very wary of the extent to which we've become dependent on cost-benefit analyses in dealing with human problems. But most of all, I am amazed that we accept as some kind of inalienable right the ability to decide the fate of a child on the basis of prenatal inspection, even though it only became possible within the past 20 years. And it seems as though there's some kind of feeling now that what is possible is something we must do. Once a technique becomes possible, we say we absolutely must carry out the experiments or tests. I would suggest that these abilities have such far-reaching implications for defining what our society is that geneticists should not be allowed to implement large-scale programs without very long and serious discussion. And let me conclude with apologies to those people that were here last March, with a passage written by Theodore Roszak describing Mary Shelley's classic book, Dr. Frankenstein. And I feel that what Roszak has written is an allegory for modern science, particularly in the area of genetics. The quote goes as follows: "Where did the doctor's, meaning Frankenstein, great project go wrong? Not in his intentions, which were beneficent, but in the dangerous haste and egotistic myopia with which he pursued his goal. It is both a beautiful and a terrible aspect of our humanity, this capacity to be carried away by an idea. For all the best reasons, Victor Frankenstein wished to create a new and improved human type. What he knew was the secret of his creature's physical assemblage. He knew how to manipulate the material parts of nature to achieve an astonishing result. What he did not know was the secret of personality and nature. Yet he raced ahead, eager to play God, without knowing God's most divine mystery. So he created something that was soulless. And when that monstrous thing appealed to him for the one gift that might redeem it from monstrosity, Frankenstein discovered to his horror that for all his genius, it was not within him to provide that gift. Nothing in his science comprehended it. The gift was love. The doctor knew everything there was about his creature, except how to love it as a person. Dr. Faustus, Dr. Frankenstein, Dr. Moreau, Dr. Jekyll, Dr. Cyclops, Dr. Caligari, Dr. Strangelove. The scientist who does not face up to the warning in this persistent folklore of mad doctors is himself the worst enemy of science. In these images of our popular culture resides a legitimate public fear of the scientist's stripped-down, depersonalized conception of knowledge, a fear that our scientists, well-intentioned and decent men and women all, will go on being titans who create monsters. What is a monster? The child of knowledge without gnosis, of power without spiritual intelligence. That's the end of Roszak's quote, and that's all I can say. I give you all of my encouragement to continue the dialogue being carried out here at Concordia between arts and science, because it's absolutely vital. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Suzuki. As a university dean, I can assure you there are very few teachers who can be successful in gathering students, professors, and university administrators into a hall such as this, gather them in front of a podium, and have them all come to the conclusion that the past hour has been a truly enriching experience, a real intellectual stimulation. I want to thank you for providing us with that stimulation. Now, a lecture at Loyola would not be complete if we did not provide the students and professors and administrators with the opportunity of throwing questions at the speaker. So I'm going to limit that question period, however, to about 15 minutes, because it is necessary for us to give a little bit of energy to Dr. Suzuki so that he can get downtown and provide and give another lecture at the Sir George Williams campus at Concordia. So if there are any questions, you can use the microphones and direct them to Dr. Suzuki.
Dr. Suzuki, congratulations, excellent lecture.
Thank you.
I have a large number of questions, but I'm going to ask now, and if I get an opportunity later on,
Okay.
I'll ask the others. So, You have mentioned in several occasions topics like the pills, sterilization, abortion, food production, etc. I will personally be very happy to know your own personal view as to overpopulation, or would you consider this as a problem per se? And what are your thoughts, if so, what are your thoughts as to its control voluntarily or involuntarily, both in Canada as well as abroad?
Well, personally, at this point, I'd be very much against any kind of legislated population control, either in this country or anywhere else in the world. Now, there are a large number of people in the scientific community who feel that the major problem facing the planet today is the unbridled population increase in the third world. And there's no question we have a population problem, and that it's going to get worse, and that something's going to have to be done, or else there's going to be a very cataclysmic result. My question is whether the major problem of population is in the third world or is in the industrialized countries. When you have countries, and it's a cliche to talk about 6% of the world's population using 50% of its oxygen, using 40% of its resources, and so on, that the industrialized countries, in fact, while being a minority of the world's population, are using by far the bulk of all of the resources of the planet. And my feeling is that the industrialized countries have got to get their unbridled population and resource utilization under control, leave what resources the third world has to the third world to exploit, and start cutting down on our own consumption before we start worrying about the unrestricted expansion in the third world. And that's my own feeling. I think we have some major problems here to deal with. Now, I think at the same time, there's a lot of criticism about the aid program. And some of you may have seen Earthwatch, which was an attempt to deal with some issues on a broad scale and to be positive about it. And I think that we've got to indulge more in small aid programs that give some measure of stability and independence to people in the lesser developed countries. But we absolutely must, if we are to remain human beings, we must try to provide the food for people who are starving on this planet today. Otherwise, I can't see that there is any major crisis when we are just eating too damn much meat and wasting food on a phenomenal scale. To talk about cutting loose members of the third world now, I think, is obscene. Wow, that kind of killed it.
Well, I'll throw at you another question, if I may. A very short one. You mentioned something like Oriental exclusion law. Does this have to do with immigration policy in Canada? I see. There is something that you mentioned with regard to the issue of triage. I think there are more than the 3 categories. Now they consider the 4th category and 5th category, etc., etc. I personally believe that this is very inhuman even to think like that. But what will it be, let's say, that if we consider that category of the population in a particular country, that no matter how much aid you give, you cannot help them at all. What is going to happen to them?
Well, Hardin classifies India, Bangladesh, and I think there are some countries in Latin America and in the South Pacific. I can't remember specifically. India and Bangladesh are the 2 major ones. Oh, and the Sahel area in Africa, as areas that must be just let go. A country that he says is worth giving aid to is Mexico, as one that is in this borderline category. His feeling is that we must stop all aid altogether and let the country go whichever way it wants. It will go given its own resources, which means, of course, starvation on a massive scale. And he feels that they've got to get it together. Now, my feeling is that ultimately we are going to come around to the point of much greater autonomy of countries. Even a country like Canada is talking, at least, about becoming independent economically, and I think in terms of resources, we'll try to become more independent. And that's got to be the way we go. But I can't see how someone like Hardin can talk about letting a country go. At the same time, it's dipping in and yanking a lot of the natural resource of those very countries and creating or exacerbating the problems of starvation and resource depletion. I think there's a tremendous amount of hypocrisy. Now, spiritually, to me, and I should say I use the term spiritually, but not in a religious sense, since I'm an atheist. Spiritually, I think that it's really interesting that he considers North American, particularly United States, civilization as the highest, or one of the highest forms of evolved society, and one that we must struggle to maintain. And he's willing to let India go, and that civilization he's willing to wipe out. I think that's a very, very ironic thing. I thought maybe there'd be an arts teacher who wanted to give me hell.
Dr. Suzuki,
Yeah.
I'd like to ask about the role that government plays in the advancement of science. Because I know here in Quebec the government is trying to interfere in the educational system so as to produce scientists who are primarily technicians. And I know also the role that government funding has in research. So I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about that.
Well, the government is controlling the shot in terms of most research that's going on in this country, except for that goes on with the military or industry. The government is the granting agent, which means ultimately it comes from the taxpayer's pocket. Now, since La Montagne published his reports, there's been a lot of pressure on the scientific community to redirect its priorities in the areas which will have some possible feedback. In other words, there should be much more mission-oriented research. Now, I think the basic issue that's being raised is one of accountability. I don't think scientists can go on any longer saying, look, we're searching for truth and you've got to continue supplying the money for that. I think there is a justification for doing pure research strictly as a cultural activity. To me, doing basic research is like being an artist or a musician or a painter or a poet. We do it because any civilized country does science. But at the same time, the implications or the applications of science have much more far-reaching results than the production of a new painting or a new poem. So we're under a second obligation, which is to translate our work to the public. Right now, the bulk of scientific literature is couched in scientific jargon, which is totally alien to most of the general public, which means that it's buried. People don't know what's going on in science. The two major groups which are able to translate science into application are industry and the military. And I think that there is a very important ingredient missing here, which is the general public's input, because we're ultimately the people being affected by the application of science. Right now, the general public is woefully ignorant about science, doesn't know how science affects their lives. The reason for that, I believe, is a tremendous mystification of science by scientists. And my long-term hope is that scientists will begin to speak English, translate their work. The general public will say, my God, that's really important. I must have a say in determining how science is used to affect my life, and therefore demand that politicians raise scientific issues as parts of their platforms when they run for office. Because ultimately, the use of science has got to be a political act, and as human beings, we've got to exercise what input we have in the political system.
I am a faculty member in the arts, and I'm not about to give you hell. I dig a lot of what you said, especially about arts and sciences getting together. The thing I'd be interested in having you comment on is there seems to be an increasing attention paid to at least some of the portions of your message about the potential dangers of genetic manipulation and so forth. Yet I haven't seen as much concern, and I remember you alluded to it briefly last year, to the effects on genetic development of humans and their behavior of society cultures like ours that depend so heavily now on infusions of chemicals, higher levels of carbon monoxide in our systems that are beginning to seems to me, have long-range implications for how we develop as a culture.
Yeah, well, I think that's a massive area, and I think, you know, there are a lot of scientists are jumping in on the funds available for screening various new chemicals that are available for their possible cancer or mutation-causing activities. And my feeling is that so long as we depend on a screening system to pick up the potential dangers, we're done, we're sunk. The reason being that that means we're committed to a society, a culture, that requires these new products, that requires a titillation of palate or mind provided by these new chemicals and drugs and so on. We are a drug technology-oriented culture. We're all drug junkies of some sort, often unwitting, often unwilling, but we are. Every one of us has in our fatty tissue dollops of dieldrin, which is a pesticide known to cause cancer. We have lots of DDT in our fatty tissue. We have all sorts of drugs that we are consuming because we can't help it, because our society is dependent on the innovation or the utilization of gobs of these things. Now, I think the Freon effect on the ozone layer is a classic case where the arguments are being made or raised. We have a multi-billion-dollar industry with the spray cans. I've never understood what the advantage of being able to push something so it jets out rather than to have to pump it like the, I remember Windex, when you just pumped the thing and it sprayed out, that was fine, you know. And yet we've now got a multi-billion-dollar industry of spray cans, and yet the arguments are made on the basis of whether or not it's scientifically proven that Freon affects the ozone layer. My feeling is, until it can be proved without a question of a doubt, that Freon does not affect the ozone layer, then industry should not be allowed to use it. And yet right now, all of the burden of proof is on the consumer to show that something is harmful. And I think as long as we're in a system like that, where industry can exploit its product until someone proves it's dangerous, we're sunk. I'm not really concerned about the genetic deterioration. Each of us carries of the order of 4 to 10 deleterious genes. If we had 2 copies of them, they would cause us to die or be very ratched up. You know, we all carry detrimental genes. There's tremendous heterogeneity built into us. I'm not concerned about that. What I'm more concerned about is something that may occur over, say, 10 or 20 years, and we may have a sudden cataclysm that results long after the initial input. For example, DES, you know, a hormone that was used on pregnant women, and 20 years later they find that drug causes cancer in the offspring, the female offspring of those women. Totally unpredictable. And I'm sure, you know, the brouhaha over red to dye now is just a drop in the bucket. There are all sorts of other things happening that are going to cause cancer or aging or whatever. But I think the nub of the thing is, why do we need to have meat red in the first place? You know, or why do we need to have sweeteners or colors or whatever? And from that standpoint, I'm very pessimistic.
In your comments regarding art, you said something or other about its relation to science. I'm not sure exactly to what sort of art you're referring. I think you're referring to an art which pertains to mass media. Am I right in this?
Sorry, I'm not with your question.
Well, I wondered to begin with if you'd be a bit more specific about the kind of art that you're talking about. You say art very generally, but I don't get the drift of your comments because they're just too general for me.
Well, when I talk about art, I'm talking about people who say they're artists and paint, or poets who write poetry, or
music, people who compose music. Well, in the first place, there's a tremendous isolation
of the artists who continue